Finally, it has begun again. Come September of 2023, a new Mortal Kombat game will be released, and with it, a new entry in gaming's bloodiest franchise. It's hard to understate just how hyped the community is for this game. It might still be early days, but with so many classic characters already featured, and coming off the back of the incredibly successful MK11, this has the potential to be the best entry in this franchise yet. From a gameplay standpoint, it's already looking to be one of the most dynamic and unique entries in the MK universe. That being said, I can't help but be a little worried for the game's story, especially since NetherRealm has seen fit to reset their franchise's continuity once again. Don't get me wrong, sometimes the best way to reinvigorate a story is to start from scratch, and based on what we've seen so far, it does appear that NetherRealm is going to be taking this reboot a lot more seriously this time. However, after considering how their previous reboot turned out, the writers for MK1 are going to have to seriously step up their game if they want this storyline to succeed. Or at the very least, they need to give their fighters the time and respect that they all deserve. So how can they do this? Well, I think the best way would be to look back on the previous Mortal Kombat timeline, consider all the many twists and turns that occurred throughout its long narrative, and what this new timeline can learn from NetherRealm's previous work. From the good to the bad to the just plain bizarre. Let's see what we can learn from the time travel era of Mortal Kombat. Before we get into the meat of each game's narrative, we should probably start by looking at how NetherRealm sets up their story modes. In the past, their stories were primarily told via the arcade mode, which if you've never played a fighting game before is basically a gauntlet run, where you need to defeat a select number of fighters before taking on the final boss. Upon completion, each individual fighter was given their own ending to progress their respective storylines. Sometimes a character's story would intersect with other characters or even cross over into the game's main narrative, but for the most part, everyone would be doing their own thing. It was a simple but effective way to sell the idea that every character in a fighting game was the main character of their own story. No one person was viewed as lesser than someone else, allowing players to easily get invested in a wide roster of characters, and for a long time, that's how many fighting games handled their story modes with very little deviation. NetherRealm was no different. With the exception of their spin-off titles, they followed this blueprint for all of their mainline entries. It was the easiest and most effective way to progress the narrative of their franchise without needing to bombard the player with constant exposition and dialogue. Furthermore, if by chance an arcade ending didn't fit with the next game's narrative, then the developers could simply make it non-canon and move on, having it serve as a what-if scenario whilst also adding more layers to a character's story. Simply put, this form of storytelling gave the developers a lot more freedom to change and alter events without the fear of contradicting themselves. But with MK Deception, things started to change. The developers shifted away from this simpler form of storytelling and began experimenting with new ideas. Hoping to create something which could provide players with a wider scope of this franchise's universe, their first real attempt was through Conquest mode. By introducing an RPG-styled game mode that focused on the life of new character Shujinko, NetherRealm was able to seriously expand their game's lore. First by setting Conquest mode before the events of the original Mortal Kombat and having it end with present-day events. This shift in time immediately gave the developers free reign to showcase the MK universe in a way that hasn't actually been done before, getting players invested in a new character whilst also adding genuine drama and mystery to their franchise, all the while providing players with context for what happens in the arcade mode without undermining the game's vast roster of characters. Everyone still has their own individual character endings, but now we had a larger understanding of how this game's storyline came about, without having to rely solely on a short pre-rendered cutscene or text bubble. Conquest mode was seen as a big step forward for the MK storyline, with the only major downside being that the gameplay got a little monotonous as time went by. So it was no surprise that they kept the mode for the sequel, Mortal Kombat Armageddon, but this time they made some notable changes to provide a more engaging experience. Ditching the RPG mechanics, this time NetherRealm transformed their story mode into more of an adventure game, with gameplay more closely resembling the spin-off title Shaolin Monks. Once again, we follow a new character. This one is called Taven, who is on a quest to defeat Blaze, a powerful being who was created to decide the fate of all realms in the MK universe. We follow Taven as he journeys across the realms, gathering the power necessary to complete his quest, whilst also meeting the many key figures who will play a role in Armageddon. So unlike Deception, Taven's journey follows concurrently to the arcade mode, with every other character's ending effectively serving as a what-if scenario where they completed the quest before Taven did. It was interesting to learn what would happen if many of these characters did attain godlike power, whether to conquer the universe, switch places with their twin, or simply earn the respect of others. MK Armageddon's arcade mode served as a nice little introspection for its massive roster of characters. Excluding spin-off titles and re-releases, MK Armageddon was the last entry in the original MK timeline, and boy did it end with a bang. So naturally, there was going to be a lot of expectations for its sequel whenever it came out. However, before we got our next entry in the main timeline, NetherRealm joined forces with DC Comics in 2008 to give us a rather surprising crossover title, Mortal Kombat vs DC Universe. It was this title which not only laid the groundwork for Mortal Kombat's modern style of gameplay, but it also introduced what would become the basis for all NetherRealm story modes, the chapter system. In an effort to give players a more cinematic experience, NetherRealm took everything they'd learned from Conquest mode and channeled it into their traditional gameplay format. Gone is the more open style of gameplay, now it's all about combat on a linear plane. As such, to accommodate this shift, Ed Boon wanted to try something which no other fighting game had attempted before, which was to create a fully motion captured and voice acted story mode, whilst also allowing for seamless transitions between gameplay and cutscenes, something which very few fighting games at the time were brave enough to even attempt. It was ambitious to say the least, but Ed Boon knew there was potential to be found creating a proper cinematic story, especially since it allowed them to appeal to both casual and hardcore fans. After all, watching characters move and interact with each other definitely resonates with players more than a couple still images with some text on the screen. The culmination of this idea was the chapter system. In a nutshell, MK vs DC Universe's story was broken down into select perspectives on certain characters. With every chapter, the player will be given control over one character, and as such the narrative will follow this particular character until the chapter's conclusion. Once done, you'll be given control over a different character and follow their journey throughout the story until the chapter's completion. This process would repeat until you've completed the story mode. It's a pretty straightforward setup, and on paper it sounds like a natural evolution of NetherRealm's previous story modes. From a narrative standpoint, it allows for each character to be the focal point for a time before shifting focus to someone else, which is important especially for a franchise with so many characters, each with their own backstories, motivations, and personal rivalries. Through the cutscenes, NetherRealm is able to naturally showcase a character's growth and change as the story progresses, while from a gameplay standpoint, it's a narrative-driven method of teaching the player the game mechanics. By focusing on a single character per chapter, it allows the player to gradually grow accustomed to using a single fighter's moveset before the next chapter switches them to a new one. In practice, it's definitely an effective way for the player to learn the fundamentals of combat, especially with the naturally escalating difficulty that comes with story mode. In the end, their bravery would pay off, and Mortal Kombat vs DC Universe's story mode would turn out to be a resounding success. So it wasn't a surprise that NetherRealm would end up making this the new norm for their story modes going forward, and with every game they'd work to refine the initial concept. From adding in quick-time events to keep people engaged in the cutscenes, to putting the player up against multiple opponents to ramp up the difficulty, or by giving the player the option to play as two entirely different characters in a single chapter. Each of these additions have contributed to making the story mode more engaging and dynamic. However, even after all this time, the chapter system still has many noticeable flaws, not simply in how it's designed, but also how it's implemented within the context of a larger story. For starters, it's restrictive. With every chapter, the game focuses on a single character, traditionally giving you 4 fights to play as said character, with some chapters giving you an additional fight from time to time. There are occasions where you'll be able to switch between different characters, or you're forced to play as a particular character for a single fight. But for the most part, this is how NetherRealm's story mode plays out. It doesn't sound so bad at first, but if you were to take Mortal Kombat 9, count how many chapters are in the story mode and compare that with how many characters are just on the base roster, and you start to notice a big problem. One which has persisted throughout every entry of this trilogy and is yet to be corrected. Mortal Kombat 9's story mode takes place over the course of 16 chapters, each of which gives you control over one character from a base roster of 27 characters, 28 if you own a PlayStation. This means that out of those 27 characters who are featured in the story mode, 11 of them are unplayable, meaning that from the narrative's point of view, all 11 of these characters do nothing but lose. To put it simply, there aren't enough chapters to accommodate every character. Dun dun dun! Now I hear you ask, why is that a problem? After all, if you're playing the story mode, surely the cutscenes will be able to build up these untouched characters as credible threats, right? Well, while cutscenes are important in every cinematic story, I wouldn't consider them integral for a fighting game's narrative. There have been plenty of other fighting games throughout history that have told cohesive stories with just text and still images. Hell, that's what Mortal Kombat originally did, remember? No, what matters in a fighting game's narrative is who wins and who loses. In a way, it's a lot like wrestling. Sure, you can have a character beat up some nameless goons, cut a promo, or even attack someone close to another fighter, fighter in order to progress the story. But all of that build-up doesn't matter compared to who wins and who loses the fight. It's through battle that stories culminate, character arcs reach their conclusion, and the narrative is pushed forward. As such, when a vast majority of your roster is rendered unplayable, it makes it difficult to buy into the idea that these other characters are a credible threat to you when you know that whoever the player controls is going to win. This isn't even taking into account any of the unplayable characters who are featured in multiple chapters, or even the DLC characters. But hey, at least you can find some solace in the fact that you get to fight every character in the game at least once, right? Now you might start to think that things might have improved when the sequels came out, but no. Both Mortal Kombat X and 11 suffer from the same problem, a large roster with a story that can't accommodate for everyone. MKX has 24 characters on its base roster with 12 chapters in its story mode, so half of the roster doesn't even get a single canonical victory. While MK11 is a bit more forgiving since it actually expanded upon its story mode following the base game's release, allowing for the DLC characters to actually be present in the story mode. As a whole, with the DLC included, MK11 has 17 chapters in its story mode with 34 characters on its roster, taking into consideration chapters where you get to play as multiple characters or repeat chapters where you play as the same person, and overall 19 characters are playable in MK11's story mode, leaving 15 characters without a single canonical victory. If we were to also factor in the DLC guest characters, then that would bring the total to just 10. So a good chunk of the roster still doesn't get to win any fights, they just show up to lose. Where once every character was the main character of their own story, now only a select number of characters are considered main characters, but only for a brief moment. Once their chapter is done, the spotlight shifts to somebody else and they're effectively made redundant. If they ever show up in the story again, then they're more often just going to lose. Consider Johnny Cage. In both MK9 and MKX, he's the first character you get to play as in both story modes and serves as a solid introduction to the core gameplay. But after his chapter, he does nothing but lose for the rest of the game. So it's kinda hard to take him seriously afterwards, especially when he's capable of going one-on-one with some of the strongest fighters in the entire franchise. Furthermore, by sticking to this idea of every character requiring 4 fights per chapter, it's forced the writers to come up with some rather contrived reasons in order to justify a battle between two combatants. Like one moment you'll have Johnny Cage taking on Kano for attacking fellow combatant Sonya Blade, but then later on Jax beats him up for asking if she's single. Like seriously? You couldn't come up with a better reason to have Jax smack him around? I mean, I know Cage can be a bit annoying sometimes, but did you guys forget that you're in a death tournament with lives on the line? By doing this, it just makes all the characters look stupid, not to mention it makes the power scaling in this franchise extremely inconsistent. I mean, when your cast of characters consists of fire-spewing martial artists, demonic ninjas, demons, hybrid monsters, demigods, fully fledged gods, and living breathing paradoxes, any form of power scaling is naturally going to be very difficult to pull off. However, the Mortal Kombat universe has usually gone to great lengths to make it clear which characters are supposed to be unmatched in combat compared to others. But by having all of these characters fight each other for the most absurd of reasons, it effectively throws power scaling out the window, making it impossible to tell who's stronger than who. You see, it's things like these that make it hard to invest in the personal drama of these characters when everything else in between is so inconsistent. Granted, NetherRealm has improved in justifying the fights in their games as time has gone on, but that doesn't erase the noticeable divide between those characters who have been granted plot relevance and those who have not. Which brings me on to my next point. The developers are biased towards the villains. I want you to ask yourself this. Since the vast majority of the cast is unplayable in these games, who do you think the developers don't want you playing as? It's pretty fucking obvious who. If you're classified as a villain in a Mortal Kombat game, the chances of you having a single story chapter dedicated to you are slim to none. More often, any time a villainous character is given the chance to shine in the story mode, they're either your opponent or they're going through some character drama that forces them to question their allegiances. This is most obvious in MK9, where we have multiple chapters dedicated to villainous characters only for them to suddenly turn good or start straying the line between good and evil. Very rarely do you get the opportunity to play as a villain doing villainous things, which seriously detracts from the overall experience. After all, how can you buy into the threat these guys pose if all they do is lose? Sure, the developers can give us some big epic cutscene where they kill a crapload of people like with Sindel, but it would have been a lot more effective if you actually got to play as her fighting all these people and then killing them afterwards. That's exactly what happened in the Aftermath DLC, and it made the drama so much more palpable as a result. If they'd kept doing this throughout the entire trilogy, then it would have made made the player a lot more invested in the overall narrative, since the villains would actually have a role in both the story and the gameplay, aside from being just an obstacle for the player to overcome. But no, apparently it's better to just have them be big and scary in a cutscene only to immediately lose when they actually fight the player. Gotta justify their inclusion somehow, otherwise they might start being perceived as jobbers. For those who don't watch wrestling, a jobber is a term given to someone who frequently loses and rarely ever wins. Their purpose in wrestling is to essentially build up other wrestlers, making their opponents look stronger by comparison, while the jobber is essentially regulated to just being a punching bag and nothing more. Even if they show the potential in being a main event worthy talent, if all they ever do is lose, it's hard to buy into the idea that they could be anything more than what the audience sees. The same basic principle applies here. With the chapter system restricting players to only certain characters, the rest of the roster is essentially regulated to being jobbers and nothing more. So how can you buy into the idea that every character is the main character of their own story when all they ever do is lose? I mean, consider the fact that Kano, one of the most well-established antagonists in this entire franchise, has been featured in every entry of this new timeline, and yet he doesn't win a single fight. I must repeat, not once in the entire trilogy does he canonically win a fight. And it's not just him either. Baraka, Melina, Noob Saibot, Scarlet, Ermac, Reptile, Eren Black, Goro, Kintaro, Ferrotor, Quan Chi, all of these characters do not win a single fight in the entire time travel era. Unless they're in a cutscene, they accomplish literally nothing in any of these games. Hell, if it weren't for the Aftermath DLC, Sindel, Shao Kahn, and Shang Tsung would also be a part of this list. Isn't it frustrating to have all these really cool characters, all with their own unique backstories and abilities, and yet none of them actually get the chance to win? In its current state, the chapter system is a flawed but well-meaning attempt by NetherRealm to get players invested in their game's mythology, whilst also helping them grow more accustomed to the gameplay. However, it's pretty clear that it could have been better. If they're going to keep telling cinematic stories like this, then they need to find a way to accommodate all of their characters into their story mode, rather than having half the roster serve as walking talking punching bags. So how can they do this? Well, the funny thing is, there is actually an easy way for them to accomplish this, and it wouldn't require them to completely dismantle the chapter system or give each character their own dedicated chapter. All they need to do is just stop restricting the player to just 1 or 2 characters per chapter. Instead, they should build their game's narrative around all of their characters. Have the fights in the game be determined by the events in the story, rather than whichever character the developers decide to focus on for the next 10 minutes. At the very least, this would allow all characters to have one canon victory, ensuring that nobody is perceived as weak or useless by the player. But more importantly, this would make the narrative far more unpredictable. In theory, you could have one chapter where you play as Raiden, then Baraka, then Melina, and then ended with Kano. Hell, you could even take it a step further and include the character choice mechanic. At certain points, the player could be given the option between multiple different characters to play as. Sure, from a gameplay standpoint, these changes would make it harder for the player to grow accustomed to just using a single character, but I reckon this would have been a good thing, since it would have forced the player to adapt to an ever-changing roster whilst also giving them a taste of what every fighter is capable of. That said, if you're seriously worried about the difficulty, then don't forget you can just pause the game at any given moment to check your fighter's moveset. What matters though is that this change would allow both the heroes and the villains to be treated like credible threats, since they'd all get a chance to win. No one side is just handed loss after loss without rhyme or reason. But most importantly, this shift would allow the chapter system to be far more engaging than it currently is, which is ultimately the biggest flaw of its design. While the cinematic structure of Mortal Kombat story mode has allowed for some truly bombastic storylines, the limitations they've placed upon their own roster have made it harder to remain engaged in the action. If the player knows ahead of time what character they're playing as, then it's difficult to believe that anything bad can happen to them. Sure, there have been moments where the developers have disproved of this notion, but killing off characters in a cutscene isn't as impactful as actually having the player beat the character first, cause by doing that, then the player feels as involved in their demise as the characters in the story. That's what truly matters here, that the player feels a connection with all of these characters, not just a select few. Because in a fighting game, every character is the main character. When it comes to fictional stories, time travel can be one of the most complicated but dynamic narratives a storyteller can use. On one hand, it's an effective way to showcase a potential what-if scenario, without having it be a permanent fixture in your story. On the other hand, it's the perfect way to jumpstart a new chapter in your story, or even set up an entire narrative. In the case of the Mortal Kombat universe, time travel was a non-existent element until the 9th mainline entry, which was simply titled Mortal Kombat. This was the game which sought to revitalize the franchise by bringing us back to its beginning. However, it was explicitly explicitly not a reboot, it was a retelling. Game director Ed Boon, when describing the plot of the game, referred to it as a retelling of the first 3 games, only with one character being aware of future events. While this distinction might seem inconsequential on paper, it's actually very important, since it effectively lays out what kind of story MK9 should have been. Starting off at the conclusion of Armageddon, we see that the conflict has left everyone dead. Everyone except for Raiden and Shao Kahn, that is, the latter of whom has attained the power of Blaze, effectively making Shao Kahn the most powerful being in the universe. So in a final attempt to stop him from conquering all of reality, Raiden casts a powerful spell that sends a message to his past self through his shattered amulet, ending with the vague message, "He must win," before Shao Kahn kills him. After which we cut back to the events of MK1 and the beginning of the Mortal Kombat tournament. It's during this time that young Raiden receives future Raiden's memories, and it's from this moment that the new timeline begins. Now, I feel it needs to be repeated. MK9 is explicitly a retelling of the first 3 Mortal Kombat games, not a remake. Why is that important? Because a remake is defined by the idea that the story will play out exactly as it did originally, while a retelling introduces an unknown factor into its narrative that can potentially change how things play out. In this case, the Thunder God Raiden is aware of how events will play out in the story, but it doesn't have a complete picture. What he does have are glimpses of the future, which when paired with his future self's dying words means he has to piece together the steps he needs to take to avoid the doom that awaits him in the future. A future which inches ever closer, as symbolized by the growing cracks on his amulet. However, with the exception of Raiden and the actions he takes throughout the story to influence the characters, everything else regarding the fighters' backstories and individual storylines should remain consistent with the original timeline. But in retelling the story of the original 3 Mortal Kombat games, it seems at some point that NetherRealm forgot this. Instead, they embraced the mindset that this was a full-blown reboot and nothing more. Even early on in the story, the developers didn't bother to hide some of the changes they've made to the characters. For starters, let's consider Sonya Blade and her co-worker Jax. In the original timeline, Jax wasn't even present at the first tournament. Originally, Sonya went to Shang Tsung's island in pursuit of Kano, traveling alongside a team of Special Forces operatives. It was this group of men that she was looking to save by participating in the MK tournament, but by the end of the first game, her team ended up dead and she was captured by Shang Tsung along with Kano, both of whom were brought to Outworld in a desperate attempt by the sorcerer to appease Shao Kahn. By the events of MK2, Jax had officially joined the roster and he would end up saving Sonya during the second tournament. In essence, NetherRealm had taken the basics of Sonya and Jax's story and restructured them for MK9. So now the two of them will spend their respective chapters saving each other, rather than doing literally anything else. Sure, this goes a long way to emphasize the importance of their friendship, but they could have just as easily done that by sticking with the original storyline, so I don't see why they felt the need to change it. Next, let's look at one of the most underutilized parts of the time travel era, the cybernetic ninjas Sector and Cyrax. In the original timeline, the Cyber Lin Kuei didn't join the roster until MK3, with their goal in that game being to hunt down the rogue Lin Kuei assassin Sub-Zero. This alone tells you everything you need to know about the Lin Kuei in general. They're loyal to their own and they don't tolerate desertion. Furthermore, despite being a clan of ninjas based in Earthrealm, they held no allegiance to anyone. Rather, they sought to better themselves, usually through combat or new technology, hence why they were all willing to be turned into robots. So for Mortal Kombat 9, they sought to expand on the whole cyberization plotline. They did this by having the Lin Kuei aligned with Outworld from the events of the first game onward. This gave Raiden the opportunity to incite some conflict between the two soon-to-be cyborgs thanks to his visions. However, in the process of giving these two more time in the trilogy's narrative, they ultimately reduced them both to nothing more than lifeless goons to get beat up. The cyborgs are only a focal point in the story for about 3 chapters, and of those 3, only one of them actually lets you play as a cyborg. Furthermore, out of the 2 original robot ninjas, you only get to play as Cyrax, and that's while he's still human. To make things worse, his chapter ends with him beating and walking away from Sector, yet when we see him next in the story, he's a robot. It's as if there's a whole chunk missing from this plotline that we never get to see. So what was the point of introducing conflict between these two if they're both still gonna end up as robots? If you're not going to show us the middle point of their story, then why even bother with the first half? The least they could have done is shown Cyrax getting captured and dragged off for conversion. They did it with Smoke and Sub-Zero, so why not him? If you're going to be this lazy, then you might as well have just introduced them as robots and have Sub-Zero come to the tournament alone like he originally did. See, this is what happens when your story mode hinges on the select perspectives of certain characters. Whole plot lines and story arcs that once existed are either dropped, altered, or removed completely, more often resulting in unnecessary changes that could have been avoided if the writers were just a little bit smarter. But as it is now, it just leaves you wanting more of something that isn't there. And without a doubt, the biggest victim of these unexplained retcons is the poster girl for this franchise, Mileena. Despite being a marquee character with a well-established history, NetherRealm has seen fit to tarnish what was already perfect. What was once an ambitious, cunning woman with a deep-seated desire to surpass her sister and prove her worth to others has been replaced with a child in a woman's body. Originally, Melina's backstory was that she had been raised alongside Kitana, the princess of Edenia, with the two of them believing to be twin sisters, when in reality Melina was a clone of Kitana, created to supplant her when the time came. The initial conflict was a result of Kitana discovering this truth among other truths that Shao Kahn had hidden from her, resulting in her defecting to the good guys and killing Melina in her escape, after which Melina would then be revived by Shinnok in MK3 and begin plotting her revenge against her sister. Sure, Melina also had the desire to claim the throne of Outworld from Shao Kahn, but the core of her character was this feud between her and Kitana. Their rivalry was one of the most dynamic in the whole franchise because they both saw the worst aspects of themselves in each other, which is further magnified by the fact that Kitana has everything that Melina doesn't: beauty and the right to rule. So how does MK9 retell their story? Simple, they don't. Instead, they have it so that Melina wasn't even created until the second MK tournament. Kitana basically stumbled upon her after Raiden gave the girls some vague advice, and finally Melina is now completely subservient to Shao Kahn. There is no emotional connection, no history between them, and no personal desires for our favorite monster girl. She has nothing. In one fell swoop, MK9 destroyed one of the franchise's most iconic rivalries, whilst also removing any agency Melina might have had in this story, reducing her to a one-note villain with no bloody character. All she has left is a sex appeal, and NetherRealm keeps toning that down with every freaking game. Look, I get you want to be seen as mature and grown up, NetherRealm, but I think you need to face the facts. This is a franchise where death is a constant. People break bones, tear out organs, and steal each other's souls. The last thing anyone in this franchise cares about is what clothes the characters are wearing, so why would the audience care? Furthermore, Melina is one of the many fighters where an overly sexualized appearance actually fits her character. She is meant to be the personification of beauty and the beast. For Melina, you can't have one without the other. Sorry about that, I kinda got a little bit off topic at the end there. Okay, let's try to get back on track. Now, to be fair, the original MK trilogy didn't have a cinematic story mode, just text prompts and character descriptions in order to dictate that game's narrative. Yet even from these, we got a clear idea of who these people were, their motives, and any major character dynamics they might have had by the end of the trilogy. So NetherRealm already had everything they needed to tell the story of MK9, whilst also laying the groundwork for the rest of this new trilogy of games. All they needed to do was follow the first three games' basic story beats, keep the history and dynamics of their fighters the same, while using their walking talking plot device to change how the story plays out. Like when Raiden saved Smoke from the cyber Lin Kuei, preventing him from becoming a cyborg like he originally did, or later on when the heroes managed to prevent the Soul Nado from consuming all the souls of Earthrealm's people. Moments like these work in the game's favor since they directly reference events that happened in the original timeline, but sadly these moments are quite infrequent. As for the remainder of the story, it does follow most of the same beats as the original trilogy. However, Raiden's tampering does lead to some unexpected outcomes, the biggest of which is that by the end of the game, half of the main cast ends up dead and turned into evil zombies. But at the very least, Raiden managed to complete his original mission and averted Armageddon. So happy days, right? No more retcons? Well, I would like to say yes. Despite all of its faults, MKX only managed to include one retcon, and that was just so they could insert their new bug lady into the previous game's events. Even then, it's an obscure scene and it doesn't damage the narrative of the previous title. But then along came MK11, which somehow managed to make MK9's story an enchanting epic by comparison.
I swear to God, I'm losing it. Can't someone, anyone, explain to me what the hell is going on? Right? I've been in the future for a whole hour and I haven't seen one jetpack. Not one.
Okay, so imagine this. You're NetherRealm. You just managed to revitalize one of the most famous fighting game franchises in the world with a well-crafted retelling of the first three games. Following this, you released a sequel which, while met with praise, also had its fair share of controversy due to numerous story decisions and gameplay changes. Now you've left your audience with one hell of a cliffhanger and the promise of a new emotionally gripping story in the near future. However, you failed to take into account two things. One, your audience is still frustrated with the fact that you killed off half your roster in a cutscene, and two, you've yet to properly resolve any of the plot lines relating to these still dead characters because they're now evil undead zombies with no character. So what do? Do you either A, accept the fact that you made a genuine mistake and work to correct this issue with smart writing, trusting that your audience will forgive your mistake, or B, double down and make things even more convoluted by resolving everything with even more retcons? Gee, I wonder what NetherRealm did. In a desperate attempt to close off this trilogy and finish off the many side stories which NetherRealm had left open, MK11 boldly decided to go all in on the time travel aspects this series introduced in MK9. How did they do so? Well, by introducing a new character, Kronika, the Keeper of Time. She's been the one directing events throughout the MK universe. Naturally, she's a little pissed that Raiden has been tampering with her perfect universe, so she wants to reset history and get rid of Raiden once and for all. In order to do this though, she needs to prepare her hourglass, which will take time and many resources which she has yet to acquire. So first she's gonna need some backup to ensure her plans go uninterrupted, which brings us to the Time Quake, a massive cosmic event in which Kronika effectively stops the flow of time and merges the present day timeline with the past. In essence, it's an overly convoluted way to bring back characters who are dead into the present day story. For our returning cast from MK9, it's as if somebody ripped them away from the second tournament and unceremoniously dumped them in the future, forcing them to bear witness to what awaited them if they'd continued down the road Raiden's visions were leading them on. Now at first you might think this was a clever move on NetherRealm's part, since it allows them to effectively develop their characters at a fast pace, mostly by having them be confronted by their future selves. Furthermore, it paves the way for numerous character dynamics which hadn't been seen in an MK game before. I mean, I never thought I'd get to see Johnny Cage bitch slap his younger self, but I'm glad it happened. Furthermore, with the Aftermath DLC, they're able to incorporate the DLC characters within a pre-established narrative thanks to more time travel magic. It's genuinely impressive that NetherRealm managed to pull all of this off. However, much like MK9, this blending of two timelines ultimately comes undone when you start to realize that the vast majority of these characters all lack the one thing you need to maintain in any long-running narrative: consistency. Despite having two games featuring a roster full of well-established characters with their own respective dynamics, personalities, and history, NetherRealm somehow still can't maintain consistency with its own characters. Like, if you're going to tell me that the time travel cast of MK11 are meant to be the same characters from MK9, then I'd ask what you're smoking, cause that's clearly a lie. For starters, let's look at Katana. I would question why she and everyone else aren't wearing the same outfits they were wearing in MK9, but fuck it. Character designs are never consistent in this franchise. Anyway, the Katana we've seen throughout the reboot era has been one defined by her own ego. She's the daughter of Shao Kahn and the princess of Outworld, so why wouldn't she immediately think she's the best fighter around? After all, she has the skills and the charisma to back it up. It wasn't until she was beaten by Liu Kang that she began questioning this idea of herself, and following the discovery of Melina, Katana's whole reality shattered. Her father wasn't who he said he was, and she'd been living a lie her entire life. So now we're left with a character whose whole world had been turned upside down. Somebody who had nothing. No power, no family, nothing at all. Naturally, she'd want to better herself and try to live up to the ideals that her real father had instilled in her before his death. So following the Time Quake, we should be seeing a more heroic Katana emerging from the sands of time, right? Except, where is her ego? Her desire to prove she's the best? You'd think something which had defined her character for so long would just disappear? No, remember, this is still MK9 Katana. Sure, she'd want to better herself, but change like that wouldn't be immediate. If anything, we should have seen her struggle more to connect with others, whether they're her allies or her enemies. I understand you want to keep the story moving at a brisk pace, but this Katana doesn't even get to meet her evil self, so you can't force her development like you can with the other characters. She has to take her time, but NetherRealm doesn't give her time, unless you count off-screen events, which I don't. To put it simply, neither her character or her development fits for where she is in her own story. She's far too nice and there's not enough of the conflict which was present in her during MK9. And it's not just her, there are plenty of characters that are inconsistent with the MK9 iterations. Past Johnny Cage is far too childish and immature, especially since he's already survived one death tournament and is in the midst of developing a relationship with Sonya. Kung Lao is noticeably a lot more arrogant and hot-headed than in MK9. Sure, he always had a rivalry with Liu Kang, but it was originally a lot more friendly and far less antagonistic than what we see in MK11, while Sonya seems to be lacking in both compassion and emotion, although I think that's mostly due to Ronda Rousey's performance. As if mischaracterization wasn't bad enough, the developers have seen fit to retcon a number of characters' backstories in order to better fit this new storyline. Like Erron Black, one of the new characters introduced in MKX, he was a gunslinger that was gifted with immortal life by Shang Tsung for his continued service to Outworld. In MK11, there was no mention of his longevity or his ties to Shang Tsung. Instead, his past self is in a partnership with the Black Dragon, and he originally came to Outworld looking for adventure. How thrilling. MKX made it explicitly clear that Erron had no ties to the Black Dragon. In fact, in the intro dialogue between him and Kano, Erron openly mocked the idea of joining his criminal empire. Sure, he was always a gun for hire, but Erron's character was also meant to harken back to the Western idea of the lone gunslinger. He wasn't just some random criminal with a wacky southern accent. What about Cabal? In MK9, he was a former member of the Black Dragon who decided to turn his life around and become a cop, something which was consistent with his original iteration. But during the Outworld invasion, he ended up being severely burned by Kintaro. He would have died, died, but he was saved by Kano, who managed to get him medical help. After which Kano proposed to his old friend that he should return to the Black Dragon, but upon realizing that Kano was helping the invasion of Earthrealm, he turned against him. So what we have here is a man with a clear moral code who's made mistakes in his past and is now trying to better himself. Which is why it's so startling to see him working alongside Kano during the events of MK11. That's right, we have another man who was openly against Kano in the past 2 games suddenly working alongside him with no explanation. What will these developers think of next? Hell, that's just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to MK11's retcons. Jade, who was explicitly single in MK9, is now in a relationship with Kotal Khan, a character who didn't exist in the original timeline and wasn't introduced until MKX. It certainly doesn't help that neither character ever referenced being in a relationship in the past. I mean, I can understand why Jade didn't, since she thought he was dead, but what was Kotal's excuse? What, he doesn't have one? Oh, okay. So basically this development came out of nowhere. Kinda like what happened to Scarlet, a DLC character from MK9 who had her entire backstory changed for MK11. Originally she was a construct created from the blood of Shao Kahn's defeated enemies, sent to eliminate high priority targets for the Emperor, but now apparently she's an orphan that Shao Kahn took in and taught blood magic. Granted, this change isn't too bad since she had no role in this trilogy up until MK11, but still this alteration doesn't actually do anything in the grand scheme of things. The developers could have kept Scarlet's original backstory in the game and her role in the story would not have been affected in the slightest. At least making Jade and Kotal a couple actually had a purpose in the plot. Same with Cabal and Eren working with the Black Dragon. This on the other hand was just a retcon, for the sake of being a retcon. Of course, Scarlet's changed backstory is nothing compared to what NetherRealm did to Sindel. That's right, I've been putting it off long enough. It's about time we talked about the most controversial retcon of them all. What is with NetherRealm and drastically retconning their villains? Seriously, first you ruin Melina and then Sindel? What the fuck, guys? Anyway, let's start from the beginning. In the original continuity, Sindel is an unknowing slave to Shao Kahn, brought back to life in MK3 after her death so that he could conquer Earthrealm. But through visions of her past, Sindel realizes that she was once married to King Jared, ruler of Edenia, and had a daughter named Kitana. But after Edenia was conquered, Shao Kahn killed her husband, stole her daughter, and forced Sindel to be his wife. But through the events of MK3 and later titles, Sindel managed to break free from Shao Kahn's influence. Once done, she set out to reconnect with her daughter, working alongside her to free all of those under the Dark Lord's influence, whilst also making amends for all of her own sins. Her story is a memorable one to MK fans because it contrasted perfectly with her physical appearance. She gave off the mystique of a dark queen when in reality she was a faithful wife and loving mother. But then MK9 retold the story of the first 3 games, and for the most part they kept her backstory exactly as it was. She was once queen of Edenia who had a daughter called Kitana. Before the events of the game, she sacrificed herself to place a spell over Earthrealm to protect it from invasion, so Shao Kahn got Quan Chi to resurrect and brainwash her into serving him once more. Then in a rather shocking turn, Shao Kahn killed Shang Tsung and used his souls to empower Sindel, making her even stronger. After which she proceeded to murder half of the MK roster before she was finally killed by Nightwolf. Following that, she was made an undead revenant for the rest of this timeline, working with Shinnok and MKX to conquer Earthrealm. But then along came Aftermath, a DLC expansion for MK11 which sought to include the DLC characters in the main campaign, one of whom was Sindel. During its events, Sindel would be restored to life, allowing her to reconnect with her daughter, and for a moment it would seem that the developers were sticking with her original backstory, where she was a victim who'd been manipulated into committing evil deeds. However, towards the end of the DLC, Sindel would ultimately betray Kitana and declare her allegiance to Shao Kahn, confessing to her that she'd never been under any manipulation when she was alive, and that she was the one that killed her father, King Jared. Also that she could rule Outworld with Shao Kahn, because apparently she's a power-hungry gold digger who wants to enslave the universe. Okay. I'm going to do my best to restrain myself for a moment and approach this revelation as humanely as possible. First of all, not only does this go against the original continuity, which her backstory in MK9 was supposed to be a retelling of, it goes against the narrative which they wrote for her in MK9. Remember, in both continuities, Sindel needed to be mind-controlled because she would not willingly serve Shao Kahn. She was actively against him. So tell me, if she wasn't actively opposed to his empire and his ideals, then why the fuck would she have needed to be mind-controlled in MK9? If she was always on his side, then why wouldn't Shao Kahn simply let her be herself? Not only does this twist bring out some major plot holes within the continuity of this new timeline, but it also goes against Sindel's character in the original timeline which she's based off of. It's pretty clear that this revelation was nothing more than a cheap retcon made for the sake of a twist. It serves no other purpose than to surprise the player, and it just leaves you wanting the original Sindel, not this gold-digging bimbo. That being said, not all of these retcons and alterations have been to the detriment of the franchise's narrative. There are quite a few that actually work really well, like how they altered the stipulations of the second MK tournament, having it so that if Shao Kahn won, he gets to invade Earthrealm, thus negating the original 10 required victories, but if he'd lost, then he'd be forbidden from merging Outworld with Earthrealm. This effectively gives both sides genuine motives to gamble on such a risky plan, rather than simply having the second tournament be a trap set to get revenge on Earthrealm for their victory in the previous tournament. Furthermore, while Kung Lao's surprise involvement in the first tournament was technically a retcon, MK9 wasn't the game that originally made this change. It was the spin-off Shaolin Monks which introduced this idea, and I must say it goes a long way to help set up his relationship with Liu Kang, as does him being trained by Bo Raicho alongside him. In the original timeline, this technically didn't happen until much later in the franchise. Finally, I like that they actually altered the conflict between Frost and Sub-Zero to fit the new timeline's narrative, having it be more about respect this time rather than a lust for power. It really helps her stand out more, and it's one of the few times where the new narrative actually justified such a change. Although I do wish she wasn't the only robot ninja we got to play as in MK11. But at the end of the day, all of these changes and alterations wouldn't have been so bad if they bothered to just explain them in universe. But since so many of them aren't, you're just left asking why. Why all the overly convoluted retcons? Why all the sudden shifts in character? Why the lack of consistency? It just doesn't make any sense. Could it simply be because the developers ran out of convenient opponents for our roster to beat up? Is that why they keep forcing some characters into antagonistic roles? So there would be more opponents for the player to fight? Then maybe you shouldn't have murdered half your fucking roster. Frankly, I'm not entirely certain there is a real reason for these retcons anymore, but I do know this: when you alter the backstory of your characters like this, or change who they are as a person in the midst of your own story, they won't resonate as much with the player. Rather, they'll come off as an entirely different character, devoid of everything that made them who they are. Sure, you can make them look and sound the part, but if they don't portray the part, then the audience won't be convinced. Without solid reasoning for so many sudden changes, the audience won't be amazed. They'll just be left in disbelief, all the while frustrated with the fact that you don't respect your characters as much as your audience does. To make matters worse, NetherRealm had the perfect setup for this trilogy. They had all the pieces they needed to tell their ideal story, but they simply couldn't fit them together in a satisfying way. I don't know whether it was due to drama behind the scenes, a lack of commitment, or a weird blend of the two, but the fact is, constantly having to change aspects of your story just shows a lack of faith in your own work. Like, consider the fact that MK9 ended with the promise of a great war between NetherRealm and Earthrealm, while Shinnok would be taking center stage as the next big villain. Only in MKX, Shinnok ends up being defeated in Chapter 1. So the rest of the story consists of an overly long fetch quest in order to retrieve his amulet to stop him from being freed, all the while constantly cutting back to various flashbacks that took place prior to the main game's events. But you want to know the worst part? The vast majority of these flashbacks are set up for various new characters, meaning that because of the little massacre that occurred in MK9, the writers had to put the main narrative on hold, just so they could spend more time setting up all these new characters. As a result, the story of MKX feels both incomplete and lacking in many key areas, like the Outworld Civil War. Despite being set up as a major part of the game's narrative, this plotline only had 2 chapters dedicated to it, which is hardly ideal, especially since it's effectively the catalyst for the main plot. It's the exact same case for Dark Raiden. Despite stopping Shinnok and saving Earthrealm, MKX didn't conclude on a hopeful note. Rather, it ended with the image of a darker, more vicious Raiden, hell-bent on destroying anyone he perceived as a threat to his home. The audience was left with the possibility that going forward, we'd be seeing one of this franchise's greatest heroes become one of its biggest threats. Yet come MK11, Dark Raiden ended up being deleted from the story after only 1 chapter, leaving us with just past Raiden, who's now left with the knowledge that he becomes a tyrant in the future. Keep in mind, we don't actually get to see Raiden be evil in MK11. He had one moment of questionable morality in the story, but aside from that, he doesn't really do anything remotely villainous, so we're just left to assume what he could have done during this time period to earn everyone's disdain. It seems to me that these developers are truly incapable of committing to their ideas. Even if they do, they usually do so in the worst way possible. Looking at you, Chronica. At the time of writing this script, I only have a rough picture of MK1's story, yet with every new trailer it's becoming pretty clear that the studio is trying to shine a spotlight on those fighters who sadly didn't get much of a chance to shine in the time travel era. One could argue that it was simply due to bad writing or the lack of any forward planning, but it's become apparent that the restrictions NetherRealm forced upon themselves played a bigger part in this neglect than even they want to admit. When you have a story mode that's clearly biased towards its villains, devotes all of its attention to only a select part of its roster, constantly alters the backstories and canon of its own universe, whilst also refusing to commit to the status quo it's set up for itself, it's easy to see how so many characters failed to truly resonate with players. They simply didn't have the time or the opportunity to make their mark, leaving us constantly to wonder what could have been. But you know what? When thinking about the time travel era as a whole, so many of these retcons and alterations could have worked, if they'd simply done what the Flashpoint paradox did and have Raiden's message through time cause a ripple effect. What do I mean? Well, for those who don't know, the Flashpoint Paradox is a DC Comics storyline where Barry Allen, aka The Flash, traveled back in time to save his mother from being murdered. However, rather than this one act simply changing his own life, it inadvertently caused a ripple effect, twisting and distorting both events and characters all across his universe, resulting in a new timeline that's vastly different from the one which he remembered. The end result was a world too broken to be saved and was used as a means to retcon the entire DC universe. Sound familiar? Mortal Kombat 9 could have done something similar with their own storyline. Consider this, Raiden has a spell that allows him to project his own memories and experiences to himself, a power which by all accounts would be incredibly useful for preventing future conflicts. So why hasn't he used it until now? Simple, unlike a certain Scarlet Speedster, Raiden is fully aware of the consequences of using this power. It's not simply a means from which he can redo events. With the added notion that its mere usage will automatically cause past events to be altered, this is not an ideal spell to use for someone seeking a specific desired outcome, so he reserves it for when he has no other choice, effectively making it his nuclear option, which is in keeping for his character. Raiden is a leader and a strategist after all. He wouldn't want to gamble on a power this unpredictable. Furthermore, with so many capable fighters working to protect Earthrealm, he has little reason to even consider using this spell. But then Armageddon happens, everyone dies, and he fails to stop Shao Kahn from attaining the power of Blaze. Left with no other option, Raiden sends a message to his past self, hoping that he'll be able to change things. But in doing so, a ripple effect occurs. Characters who weren't present during specific points in time are suddenly there, entire relationship dynamics have shifted, and Raiden is now left with a mental blueprint of a timeline that no longer exists. To add more weight to this, you can even have Raiden openly acknowledge the unintended consequences of the spell with Liu Kang, which will naturally add more friction to their relationship, whilst also emphasizing the importance of their bond. Also, it explained why Kronika chose not to immediately reset history after Raiden sent his little message. She hadn't expected the Thunder God to actually use this power, but once he had, she chose to observe events to see how everything played out. It was only after Dark Raiden decapitated her son that she realized they'd crossed the point of no return. Now that he was actively hunting down threats throughout the realms, the likelihood of Armageddon taking place was extremely slim. Her perfectly balanced universe had been tarnished, leaving her with no other choice but to enact her own plan. Granted, these are just my thoughts on the matter, but I reckon if NetherRealm had placed more importance on the ramifications of their time travel plot, then the overall narrative of this reboot would have worked out a lot better in the long term. But then again, this trilogy wasn't meant to be a simple reboot. It was a retelling. NetherRealm might have forgotten that, but I haven't. So, what can we learn from the time travel era? That while the chapter system is flawed, it does have the potential to be better. If you've firmly established something about a character within the canon of your universe, you can't just retcon it later to fit an entirely new narrative. Furthermore, while killing off a character is an effective way to shock the player, if you don't effectively plan out the rest of your story, it'll only end up causing problems for you. Even in a universe where death is often seen as temporary, character deaths should be treated with respect. And finally, commit to your ideas, don't just brush them aside. If you've set up a major plot point at the end of one game, make sure it has a satisfying payoff in the sequel, especially when your audience is excited to see how your characters change and grow when faced with these new challenges. Mortal Kombat 1 might be set up as a fresh start for this franchise, but it's still carrying over the legacy of its predecessors, and unfortunately that includes all of the faults present in their previous titles. So while from a visual standpoint it does look as though we'll be getting a deeply engaging narrative, I'm not going to jump to conclusions and say that this game will be a masterclass in visual storytelling. I won't deny that it has the makings of being the most unique entry in this franchise yet, but can it succeed where the time travel era failed? Well, only time will tell.